Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is May, and this is the second episode of the Pray and Act podcast. The Pray and Act podcast is an initiative of the Muamalat movement to bring current events to you through the lens of Islam. Today, we are joined by Mr. Sakib Hamid. Sakib Hamid is a student of Shaykh Umar, and I think he is the student of Shaykh Umar that has actually been with him the longest. Sakib is from the UK, from England, and Sakib has an incredible amount of knowledge on different aspects of Islam. Muamalat he knows tons about, but what I'm really interested in talking to Sakib about is history. Sakib is a little bit of a walking encyclopedia when it comes to history. And I want to pick his brain today a little bit about a certain topic that is not talked about quite enough, which is banking and the evolution of banking from the medieval period up until today. But before we get into that, Sakib, would you please elaborate a little bit on my introduction and maybe tell the people how did you end up here today in Ankara? What is your journey briefly been like?
Okay.
Go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum, and thank you for having me.
My pleasure.
So, how I came to Ankara, it's a bit of a mysterious story, but to cut a long story very short, when I was about 18 years old, I started to find videos that explained things like what actually is the money, what is the dollar, what is the Federal Reserve, and its role in the global monetary system. And when I realized that what we call money today is a hoax, and suddenly I found voices that, Islamic voices that say, this is our issue. This is an Islamic problem. Islam is not just rituals, but it deals with wider concerns of society and economy and politics. And then eventually this led me to listening to Shaykh Umar's Praxis of Prosperity talks around 2021, I believe. And then from there onwards, I was just hooked. I wanted to know more. Eventually, I met him in Istanbul, and so a new chapter of the history began. I stayed with the Sheikh since.
And how many years has it been?
So for me, it's been over 3 years.
Over 3 years already.
Yes.
And this story sounds a lot like Yasser's story as well. When I was speaking with him last week, and I asked him the same question. What got him interested in Muamalat, and he said that it was when he understood that money in Islam is not paper money like how we know it today or digital currency. Money has a very, very different set of criteria, and it was when he understood this that everything shifted for him, because it's precisely we get so accustomed to the narrative and to the way things are. And we grow up thinking that the way everything is right now is normal. And if you grow up as a Muslim, the Uluma and the Sheikhs, they're all endorsing it.
Yeah.
So there's really no need to question, but it's precisely the moment when you figure out that something is actually not normal that you have this breakthrough. And for me also, it was paper money when I understood that money is not paper money. It cannot be paper money. It has to be a commodity. Everything just completely shifted for me. And I think it goes together with money. It's inseparable. Something that is not questioned today and is kind of seen as just a natural part of life is the banks. And the banks is exactly what we're going to talk about today. And I'm particularly interested to understand the development of banks, how banking started, and how we kind of got to where we are today. Because even within the development of banking, there has been so much change from first banking actually being backed up by gold to then partly being backed up by gold and today just being backed by nothing. But we'll get into all of that. First, I would like to ask you to please tell me a little bit about the birth of banking in medieval Italy. If you could expand a little bit here.
Yeah, so this is very important. The word bank comes from banca, which is to do with the benches and tables where the money changers and money lenders used to typically sit. right? So every city had money lenders and money changers, historically speaking. And they were always subject of controversy. And in Islam, because we have such thorough laws against riba, we had particularly, we gave them a tough time to make sure that there's no riba happening, because they were called in Arabic sarraf. It was very easy for them to fall into riba, even what appears innocent on the surface. So the Christians, they had a notion of usury, but it was nowhere near as robust and as thorough and as detailed as our definitions of riba and our laws against it. So this led to, for example, in 1191, there was a champagne fair in France, and you had a bunch of Italian merchants. Instead of paying with gold and silver, they started to pay with pieces of paper that promised gold and silver. How these pieces of paper came about, so let's just say going from Genoa to the Champagne Fair, it was a dangerous journey. What they tended to do was they would go to one moneylender, deposit their money with them in exchange for a piece of paper. That piece of paper would give them the right to redeem the cash written on it in another city with another agent or moneylender. When that system, even in Islam, this was heavily frowned upon, these instruments called suftajat, they didn't like it. But the Christians didn't have that restriction. And they just went absolutely crazy. They started to turn them into bills of exchange and actually started to make payments with these pieces of paper. Add to that the following mix that, hang on, the currency in, let's say, Genoa is different from the currency in Brussels. Maybe the Italian one is more valuable, and they would take advantage suddenly of the difference in value, meaning that, they were profiting from the difference in value. So it wasn't a fair exchange. And riba upon riba started to grow from there.
Okay, so you're saying that within these exchanges and within the creation of these promissory notes, there is riba.
Yes.
What about it is riba?
Okay. So first of all, when a loan is given, you have to pay something back in the same kind. Right? So if I give you 5 dirhams, 5 silver coins, you have to pay me back 5 silver coins. What they were doing is they were manipulating the differences between the currencies in order to profit. So they would say, okay, 5 Genoese dirhams is worth, 6, in Brussels and things like that. This is how they were manipulating. So there was riba al-fadl present there. And furthermore, buying and selling promises for cash. This is riba an-nasiya, because you should take possession of the goods itself before buying and selling with them. Instead, what they were doing is they were buying and selling the promises themselves in the markets, which is riba an-nasiya. Now, in Islam, we have a very clear episode. In fact, we have 2 episodes during the time of the Sahaba where riba an-nasiya was very strongly illustrated and condemned. The most famous one is from the Muwatta, Kitab al-Buyu, and what happened was there was a town called Al-Jar, a port city. They would receive shipments of food, and that food, which was typically wheat, would be transported to Medina, to the treasury. And from Medina, from the Medinan treasury, poor people and needy people would be able to redeem. They would be able to redeem their pieces of papyrus called a Sukuk. And on the Sukuk, it was written the name of the person, how much allocation of food there was, with the seal of the emir. And the only halal transaction with the Sukuk was you redeem the Sukuk at the treasury for the food that is promised and entitled to the recipient. Now, what happened was some people in Medina started buying and selling these sukuk. And this is under the reign of Marwan ibn al-Hakam, when he was the emir of Medina under the Muawiyan Caliphate. 2 Sahaba, Abu Hurairah and Zayd ibn Thabit radiyallahu anhuma, they saw this practice. they went to Marwan and they said, do you make riba halal? Now here we can see from these questions, because there's another narration in Sahih Muslim where this happens with Abu Hurairah. They asked the same question, do you make riba halal, or have you made riba halal? And then Marwan said, A'udhu billah, what is this? And they said, people are buying and selling with Sukuk, these papyrus sheets, before taking possession of the food that's on them. And then Marwan sent guards to undo the forbidden transactions, and he also, gave like a khutbah to the people saying, this cannot happen.
The act of passing on a promise to pay or a redemption note in Islam is clearly forbidden. We see it from the episode of Sukuk of Al-Jar.
Yeah.
But can you explain to me in simple words, what about the passing on between people is an unjustified increase? What makes it riba? What is actually happening in that transaction that is unjust?
Okay, so what is happening is people are buying and selling promises, things that they don't have possession of, things that they don't have to hand. And that is what makes it unjust. And this is what makes it, riba and nasiya, the buying and selling of promises as opposed to the goods that are actually there. Now, just to clarify, I'm not going to go into a detailed fiqh here, but are there transactions where, for example, there are salam contracts where advance payments can happen? Yes, but there are under strict conditions, right? We cannot freely, you can say, transfer debt or transfer promises, right? Or transfer obligations from me to you. We can't do it. Islam does have mechanisms to deal with things like indebtedness, things like advance payments, but it's done all within the framework to ensure that there is no riba.
Thank you for expanding. So just going out of Arabia and back to Italy, medieval times, or actually it was a bit later than that. So here we have the first instance of banking. So it was mainly merchants who were using bills of exchange.
Yeah.
It wasn't necessarily, as I understand so, that people were depositing money in the banks. It was more that people who were doing international trade were using like an early form of banking. Can you explain a little bit how banking shifted from bills of exchange to people actually depositing their money in the bank, and how that then was the culprit for Federal Reserve banking?
Okay, so there's a long chain of events that happens in between. I'll try to keep it short. So what happened was usurers and moneylenders typically had a stigma against them from even in the Christian communities. People who dealt with usury were, they were not allowed to be given Christian burials. This is how it started. Then Martin Luther and people like him, they kind of opened the door to say usury is only when it's unfair or unjustified interest, right? Maybe the interest rate is too much. So then the discussion in the Christian world changed to, okay, so how much interest rate is acceptable? So then traditionally, instead of moneylenders being considered a form of loan shark, they said, why don't we target the traders? Because traders have money, so we can't say that we're taking advantage of the needy. We offer them low interest rates, something that they can pay back in their lifetime. And so instead of people being victims of interest, they are now queuing up to take loans in the name of, I want to expand my trade. And this is where the banking really, really took off. And what happened was, by the time the Bank of England was established in 1694, and by the way, the Bank of England was established as a private entity to fund the monarch of England's war against France. That's why it was created. To indebt the king and the whole country eventually.
Yeah. Because even with the Christians, they are the ones who started really expanding on banking and making it a worldwide phenomenon. But what is really happening is with the reformists like Martin Luther and John Calvin, what they are doing is they are playing a game of semantics, really, right?
Yes.
Because before, when we looked at money, money was not anything within itself. It was only in the context of it being a commodity. And in fact, money was not always coins. It could be salt, or it could be dates. It could be anything that is commonly agreed upon to be something you can trade with. But then what the reformers started doing is they started detaching money from the pool of commodities, and said that money in itself can be something to create more money from.
Yeah.
And then there were other theologians or philosophers like Thomas Aquinas who actually did not accept this, and they were more leaning towards the traditional side of Christianity, or the non-reformist side. So can you tell us a little bit about how semantics made it possible for money to be something to be what it is today?
Yeah, this is a very good question. So first of all, the Christians had a redefinition of usury. And even now, when you look at usury, people say it's only an exorbitant interest rate, whereas before it was any interest on a loan. The second thing is the Christians only understood usury in the form of loans, which is why when the bills of exchange, in Italian cambiale, were being used, and I said, for example, they would take advantage of the difference in value of the money in London versus the money, let's say, in Genoa or Brussels or wherever. That difference where we would say, hang on a second, silver for silver, there is a clear possibility of riba here. They said, oh no, it's not a loan, therefore it's not usury, right? So they were doing linguistic gymnastics in order to keep doing what they were doing. On top of that, the role of the church began to slowly transform to what it is today, just a relic of the past. No legal, it has no legal sort of bearing.
Normative power.
Exactly. It's just a symbol and personal morality. And whilst that happened, and then you had the Enlightenment, and then before that you had the Renaissance, and all of that, the church became slowly diminished in its role and influence over the what we would call the Muamalat matters, the society, the economics and things like that. And then unfortunately that disease crept into the Muslim world.
So just like with every major religion, when it was still, when it was not abrogated by Islam, there was a condemnation against riba in all its forms. So riba of delay and riba of increase. And then slowly a reformist movement starts happening, and people reduce riba, usury interest, to just being interest on a loan.
Yeah.
This sounds to me an awful lot like exactly what is happening today with Islam. It sounds like almost the same story. So is it true that Islam has also seen a reform, and that's why most Muslims today confuse riba with just an interest on a loan? Can you tell us a little bit about that development and when that happened?
Okay, so this development happened in several stages. First of all, I'm going to focus on the Ottomans and the Mughals because they were the biggest Muslim ruling entities at the time. And they were the ones that took the first major blow, which then ricocheted throughout the Muslim world. So in the East, you had England, who over successive centuries, eventually by 1857, consolidated all their control over Hindustan. So Hindustan geographically is not just India, it's what is now also Pakistan, some of Afghanistan, going down towards Bangladesh, right? And what they did was by 1861, they had the Paper Money Act, where the government of India, which was the British government, basically started issuing paper money. And naturally, in order to keep the Muslims docile, they needed the ulama to pacify the people into these matters. What happens is later on, you have, by 1905, 1906, a prominent Barelvi alim called Ahmad Raza Khan, and he was the founder of the Barelvi movement. In Hijaz, he was specifically called upon in the Hajj season to answer questions regarding banknotes and paper note issues. And in his fatwa, which is rather tragic, you can see, first of all, he has a skewed skewed definition of what is mal. Mal is wealth in Arabic, right? It is something that is tangible. It's something that is real. Gold, silver, and anything else that you consider, valuable, rubies or diamonds or whatever, right? There was a counter resistance where some of the ulama, mainly from Deoband, people like Ashraf Ali Tanvi, did say, actually, these are certificates of debt. But the problem is, what all the ulama seem to not clock onto is, okay, whether it's certificates of debt, whether it's mal. Okay, so the mal is definitely wrong. Certificates of debt makes sense. But then to what extent can you use certificates of debt? The condemnation just did not seem, from my readings, strong enough. Nobody was saying you cannot collect zakat with it categorically. No. Zakat nisab is 20 dinars or 200 dirhams, gold and silver coins, etc., etc. And then as a result, once the popular fatwa, because Ahmad Raza Khan's fatwa went east and west, the Hajj, the Muslims gathering, all the major ulama are there. They hear this man who is put on a pedestal, and suddenly his fatwa is going towards Morocco and towards, beyond Hindustan and in the east. And now you have a globalized understanding that paper money is wealth. Why? Because somebody puts a seal on it, right? And then the discussion becomes about the value of the one who stamps it. And then the discussion, I don't want to go into it, but it starts to discuss, if somebody steals your paper notes, are they subject to the punishments of theft? This is how ridiculous the discussion became. The Ottomans, just to briefly catch on that, they had a slightly different evolution. Their problems really started with Abdul Majid I, who started to do foreign loans in the Ottoman Empire. And of course, these foreign loans to the British, to the French, to the Austro-Hungarians, to the Germans, to the Dutch, they were with interest. Now the problem really began. And then because interest, if you look at the mathematics of it, it's infinitely grows. Eventually, the Ottomans ran out of the gold and silver coins, and they said, okay, let's do this paper money business. And they called them Qaime Naqdiya or Evrak Naqdiya. And then they were saying, okay, we're going to give you these pieces of paper for trading and stuff. And then eventually we're going to back it up with the gold and silver. World War I happened. And they reneged the whole thing. And they said, okay, you have to use these pieces of paper because we've told you. It's the law. It's fiat currency.
So paper money comes into Muslim lands around the time that colonialism is also shifting from the imperial powers actually being within the countries to it becoming more of them setting up people from the spaces themselves as their representatives and them basically retreating back into their own countries. This was slowly happening at the start of the 20th century. So all before that, there was no usury in Muslim lands until like the 1850s, or?
I can't say that there was no usury because that's a big claim. But the thoroughness of understanding, you can see that it had definitely collapsed by the 1800s. And the manifestation of this is the weak condemnation or lack of condemnation about paper money. Now, maybe there was a resistance movement, but history has silenced their voices. So this is why we say Allahu Alam, Allah knows best. And, many ulama were slaughtered by the British brutally. They were physically tied to cannons and, fired the cannons and, it decimated. So maybe there were voices amongst them who dissented and spoke out. But from the records that we have available, these are the loud voices that have reached us.
Could you maybe tell us a little bit more if we go a couple of 100 years back? Europe was, especially when banking kind of started taking off, basically a swamp. Like Europe was very poor. There was not a lot of trade, especially if you compare it to the countries along the Silk Route, the Ottoman Empire, Africa. Like these regions, they were extremely wealthy and they had beautiful things. And it's basically the opposite of how we view it today. It was the East that was the rich area, and it was Europe that was, not the place to be, so to say. And all of a sudden, these Europeans are making huge voyages from, for example, the Netherlands to Indonesia, and they are going to Indonesia and convincing the people to trade with them in these paper bills. So what is the connection between Europeans starting to develop this banking system and them basically executing their colonial power or their imperial power in these other countries? Is it literally the case that they were cheating just by creating money and gathering resources from nowhere? And how could they convince the people to start trading with them in these paper bills earlier on?
I mean, this is a very good question. There are several layers to this. One thing I want to make clear is that when the colonialism happened, it didn't happen with soldiers directly from England, for example. This was the East India Company. And then you had the Dutch East India Company and the Danish one and so on and so forth. What they used to do, you had private companies with weapons. It's just basically, imagine Nestle has its own army, right? As an example of a multinational, right? They turn up at your doorstep and they say, okay, give us your resources, right? You're going to do trade according to us. The Muslims, I think they enjoyed a period of, economic prosperity. And I just don't think that they could foresee that beyond the army, the real weapon was the weaponization of riba, which is give us your resources and we will give you debt. You see, the notion of national debt, the idea that the government ends up becoming a vassal on behalf of the East India Company, doing whatever they say, and then the East India grants privileges to the ruling elite, and in exchange for those privileges, which obviously, require loans with interest. And who pays for those loans with interest? Oh, we give it to the public. And in 1881, for example, in the Ottoman Empire, something unforeseen had happened. Duyun Umumiya Idaresi, which is the Public Debt Administration, was created. And who created this department within the Ottoman Empire? It was all the foreign money lenders. So you had English, French, Dutch, Austro-Hungarian, Germany, Italy. All these foreigners came together to tell the Ottoman government, this is what you're going to do with your tax revenues. This is how you're going to pay us back. The Muslim countries were being dictated to for the first time on this level. And this weaponization of riba is something nobody could foresee.
So it's basically the colonial powers being able to infiltrate these countries on a level where they were actually there, present, and sending their soldiers and sending their people. But then on like a deeper level, they were infiltrating the monetary system. And they were establishing for these countries a constitution, which then brings with it a national debt and actually a continuous bond with these colonial powers, because there will always be this money that they have to pay back. On top of that, if they can influence the currency that is used, the legal tender, the fiat currency, they don't really even have to be there and able to control what these countries are spending their budget on, what they spend their money on. So today, we think colonialism is over, and it is maybe in the sense of the definition that we have learned. Countries, most Muslim countries are quote unquote independent countries now. But there is really no independence if there is no economic sovereignty. And what's happened is that banking, because all these countries now have their own bank and their own national debt, and the people cannot choose what they use as money, they have to choose to use paper currency. The Americans, they have established that the US dollar will be the fixed currency. So what I'm trying to ask you is, can you tell us a little bit about the US dollar and how that today is kind of a form of modern colonialism?
Yeah.
because there is no sovereignty, really.
You're absolutely spot on. There's absolutely no sovereignty unless we get rid of the banks. You see, what happened was, just to finish off the first point of your question, the colonialists actually penetrated the very daily lives of the Muslims. They destroyed the guilds by breaking the fingers and limbs of, for example, the weavers in Hindustan. They broke their machinery, and then they created monopolies by saying you can only use this as money, you can only use this as machinery from us. And then what they did is they trained a certain groups within the within the minority groups in terms of how to do banking and how to be capitalists, basically. And so when the so-called independence movements came, it was basically the same legal system and the same way of life, but with, a local looking person at the helm, as opposed to an Anglo-Saxon or someone. Now, when it came to the American hegemony in the world, how did it happen? So first of all, during World War II, Europe was pretty much broken. All the former colonial powers, Britain, France, they were on the way down very fast. And what happened was, in Bretton Woods in 1944, the US basically made the dollar as the international medium of exchange for all payments. And they said, if you want to have it in gold, you have to first of all give us the US dollars and we will redeem it for you with the appropriate amount of gold. All this went to hell when Richard Nixon became president and the Vietnam War happened, and they overprinted more dollars than there was gold to represent the dollar. And then they just casually went, no, it doesn't matter. Just because we made a promise, it doesn't mean we have to fill it. It was literally that simple. So now you have a currency which is literally backed by nothing, right? It's not even the gold standard. It is nothing. It is fiat, and fiat means that the government has enforced it as a means of payment. And the Muslims have just casually accepted it. And even now, all the savings, for example, in Turkey, 67% or thereabouts of the savings are in US dollars, which means we can burn as many, flags or whatever it is, but until we are using the American dollar, we are strengthening their economy, right? Their economy, relies on the fact that we use the dollar, and that's also considered, part of the value of the currency is how much it is circulated and traded. And now the time has come to say no, right? We actually don't need the dollar, and the example that is proving this in our age is China.
Why China? How are they proving that?
Okay, so there are a couple of things China is doing very differently compared to the rest of the world. First of all, most banks in the world, or nearly all of them, are actually private institutions. This includes the central banks by and large. The only country where all the banks are nationalized, which means the government can literally dictate what to do, is China. Now, that's one big difference. The other major difference is that China, because of its economic growth and with the new contracts that it's developing, for example, with Uzbekistan, they are saying, okay, you want to trade green energy with us? You have to pay in our payment system, in our currency, the electro-yuan. Now, the electro-yuan completely bypasses the dollar system known as SWIFT. You see how international currency exchanges used to happen. Whereas, for example, I'm sending Turkish liras and I want to sell to you in Pakistani rupees. First of all, the lira converted to the dollar and the dollar back into the rupee. This is what would be happening in the background. Now that whole relationship is being destroyed, and China is showing that through blockchain technology and modern technological means, we can actually create payment systems independent of the dollar. And for them, it's not a theory, it's something that is actually happening in practice. With Uzbekistan and several other Central Asian countries, just in green energy alone.
This sounds like a way better alternative. What's stopping everyone from just directly jumping on the wagon and saying goodbye to the US dollar and just trading with China? I mean, China has a huge influence. The hegemony is clearly shifting there. We can get tons of resources from China and close allies to China. Why are we still clinging onto the US? Is it trade, like goods that we need from them, or what is holding them in this power, this seeming power?
I mean, this is a very good question. I think it all comes down to, long-standing beliefs. Especially the old guard, I don't think a lot of them realize that today it is even easier to get rid of Americanization and the dollar. I think there's always a persistent fear of, but what if we get killed? What if we get invaded? And they constantly bring examples of, Libya and Iraq and all these, countries that, oh, look what America did to them. But the thing is, we cannot, as Muslims, live in fear of America, right? There is no might or power except Allah, la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. And, this is, the spiritual condition that we have, it also manifests in our actions. And we have to collectively absorb this to our very core, that la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah, that there is really no other strength and might and power in the universe, only Allah's. And that is really what's holding us back. And it's manifesting in the form of being scared of America's reaction. But actually, we do have the means. We don't have to necessarily even trade with China, but we can copy what they're doing, have our own payment systems, from Turkey to Malaysia to Pakistan to other Muslim countries in Africa, to Chad, to Nigeria, even Burkina Faso.
So is the way out of this capitalist system, this system that runs on riba and on banks, is it by copying China's model? Or what is the process of getting out of that?
Okay, so there are certain elements that we can take inspiration from China, but we do have our own model. This is what Muamalat really is about. So, for example, our markets should be waqf markets. We can have an electronic payment system, but it needs to be redeemable with dinar and dirham. What we cannot have is that electronic tokens are being created, but there's no dinar and dirhams to back them up. So the process is we start minting dinars and dirhams, we start circulating them as means of payment, and at the same time we have free markets where the entrepreneurs do not have to buy property, and then no one's allowed to buy property on the public market because it is for the public. It's a first come first serve. There's no rental. There's no taxation. Lower the market entry barriers completely. Provide productive infrastructure. Now, this is also where we can take from China in places like Yiwu, where they have developed clusters by providing offices, logistic points to make trade facilitated. And we can copy that much. We can, as a step one, talk about nationalisation of banking, where the government can actually control the credit according to their will, not to the will of unaccountable private organisations, but the government, whose job it is to take care of the people, that they can decide how to take care of the people the best. Okay, we want to put a market here. We want to create a cluster of this. We want to leverage our national resources for the development and the prosperity of our municipalities and our cities.
And this is also referred to as window guidance, or that's when you take private banks, but the government is heavily involved in their expenditure.
Yeah, so window guidance is the Japanese way of doing things post-World War II. And that was when the Minister of Finance of Japan directly dictated how to invest to the banks. So they said, okay, look, you can keep your profits, but you have to invest in this and this. This is how you're going to use your finances and to develop. You can't just lend to whomever you want. You have to do what we do. So it's you can say it's a backdoor nationalization. China's outright nationalization.
And is Japan still doing the window guidance model? Or?
No, unfortunately, they bought into the American narrative, and since then their economy hasn't developed as strongly as it did post World War II, especially in the 60s onwards.
So what I've learned from this conversation is that banking is something that is very normal in all of our lives, but in fact it is not normal, because the way we view money is not normal. It's never been like that throughout human history, that money is something to be made more money from in itself. It's always been a commodity, a part of trade. Then there is a way out of this banking system, and there's a couple of steps to it. And the very first thing is, as you said, la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah, because when you look at all of this, it seems super overwhelming, right? Like, how can we change literally the economic system? Like, who am I to be able to do such a thing? Where do I even start? And we see it as something very complicated, but in fact, it is very simple. Money is simple in the true sense, in the Islamic sense. Trade is simple in the Islamic sense. The economy is simple in the Islamic sense because it's fair and it's for everyone. What we're doing right now is mega complicated.
Yes.
We're very, very overcomplicating the whole thing and applying a lot of semantics just to be able to basically manipulate the wider wider population. And it's a headache almost to even start thinking about it. Like, why should I care? Of course, I've also been there. I completely understand that. Then there's a couple of steps. So we wouldn't just, we're in Turkey here today. Inshallah, we can convince the government to take steps toward a socio-economic model of Muamalat, but we can't just start using the gold dinar tomorrow instead of the lira. There have to be some steps to make that switch, and the first one of that is the nationalization of banking. What would that process look like further from this system to the nationalization of banking to fully using 100% backed up dinars and dirhams?
Okay. So after the nationalization of banking, it can be done in a couple of ways. I think we've discussed both options: outright nationalization like China has done, or through the backdoor window guidance like the Japanese model. So that's one thing. So then what can happen is the notion of sovereign wealth fund, where the central banks start, or the banking system, because now all the banks belong to one, the government. They can start to back the liras that are minted with commodities and assets. And just to clarify, the euro and the dollar are not commodities and assets, which is what the Swiss model is, right? It can be something like gold or silver or other things. And then at some point, there has to be a investment strategy. So, okay, how do you want the economy of the country to develop? Various cities, it might be preferable to have an AI or a digital development hub like what they're building in Kazakhstan. It might be, other manufacturing, and decide where to put the resources and what kind of markets that we want, right? And where to put the markets, there has to be a direction of funding. And then after that, you have to look at, the actual minting of the dinar and dirham. You have the payment systems in place. So you've got the markets, you've got the dinar and dirhams, you've got the alternative contracts now, because instead of having loans with interest, you can start to seriously look at things like Qirad contracts and rentable infrastructure as a service, as opposed to entrepreneurs taking out hefty loans. And then once you have removed all the roadblocks, now you have you've transformed the bank now into a sovereign wealth fund, as opposed to an institution of riba. And all the roadblocks that are creating riba, they've been removed. You can now pass a law saying riba is categorically forbidden. And then the reason why the law passing happens at the end, first of all, you have to create the means that you can enact and enforce the law. Right? Otherwise, you end up like in Pakistan with, Dr. Humaira, she's spoken about the Riba bill. But are they able to enforce it? This is the big question mark. But in this case, you demonstrate that you have the power to remove riba. You demonstrate you have the power to stop monopolies by creating public markets through the strategic investments and things like that. You create productive infrastructure to replace being employed by a monopolist, to becoming free entrepreneurs with low market entry barriers, and with it, and education, because the kids, they have to leave school, they have to understand university isn't the only way of education. They can now go directly to the market, find a trade that they're interested in, and learn the relevant skills. And all these things happen in parallel within these steps.
Okay. So thank you for expanding on that. So it has been thought about, it's possible. Do you yourself have any specific country in mind that you think would be able to pioneer this?
I mean, there are several, but in my opinion, and this is again my personal opinion, Burkina Faso would be an interesting starting point. And actually, between Burkina Faso and Turkey, and here's why. Turkey has demonstrated within Burkina Faso that it has military capabilities. They're developing drone factories and armaments production. Burkina Faso has a lot of gold, and they've recently started to decolonize themselves from France. So between France and Burkina Faso, Turkey and Burkina Faso, I think that would be a good test point.
Turkey and Burkina Faso.
Yeah, that's my opinion. But there are several, and Allah knows that this is just one.
Okay, thank you. So this has been so much information, and I can imagine also for the viewer, it's so much to take in. And what I would like to say is that even though it might not seem that there's a lot to do, what we can always do is start learning. The Muamalat movement has many social media profiles on which we share resources, as well as the website and a brand new website that is in development with a lot of articles. So please refer to the description of this podcast or this video to learn more. Furthermore, I want to thank you for viewing this podcast or for looking at us on YouTube and being with us, because it is very important that you are here. If you are here as a Muslim, it means that you understand that there is something that is not spoken about. And I hope that we've been able to help you there a little bit in showing you that is Muamalat. So thank you so much for being with us this episode. Thank you so much, Sakib, for all your knowledge. It's incredible. And maybe you would like to finish off by saying something to the viewer as well.
Yes. So thank you for watching, and thank you for having me. What I would recommend, because I understand this is an overwhelming subject, is go back to basics and just look at what is in the Quran and Sunnah. Study the Muwatta, for example, study the Mudawwana. And I know initially it's a daunting task, but if you reach out to one of us, we can all work on it together, and, we learn through asking questions and through dialogues. So I invite you all to participate in the Muamalat movement.
Thank you. Can we finish with Fatiha?
Yes. Bisirri wa barakatih. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.
Assalamu alaikum.